What do you think is the biggest geopolitical threat right now?
I think the biggest threat today is the instability in the Middle East with regard to Iran. I think that is absolutely problematic. And President Trump took a stable situation where the world community was together in one position, and he breached the agreement on his own, forcing now Iran to breach the same agreement. And they've started to already produce uranium and create a nuclear weapon.
So if under a Gillibrand administration, do you re-enter the Iran deal, or does that depend on Iran's behavior?
It depends on Iran's behavior, but I would immediately engage and begin to have discussions with our allies about what it would take to bring Iran back to the table, and then to have a longer-term agreement with a more wide-ranging set of issues. Both missile development as well as investment in terrorism have to be things that we as Americans put on the table to negotiate with Iran, because they do have malign activities. They do fund terrorism, and if we could enter into a longer-term agreement, for example, there'd be ways we could make it worth Iran's while, at least economically, to do so.
Let's switch to the domestic side. Big news on Capitol Hill, Robert Mueller's testimony. Obviously, Democrats, the approach seems to be, let's get him to speak and let's have him say exactly what was in the report. Do you think it's worthwhile for him to testify? And second, do you think it's time to proceed with impeachment against President Trump?
I do think the hearing is very useful, because there's an ability for Robert Mueller to explain what he meant and really to put more context onto what he stated in his report. He made it very clear that if he could have exonerated President Trump, he would have. He made it very clear that he found evidence of obstruction of justice, and he made it very clear that President Trump can be prosecuted as soon as he is left the White House. So I think his emphasis and his explanation of different positions in the report is very useful, because the American people aren't going to take the time to read his report. They might take the time to watch the news tonight and to hear the excerpts of what he said in this hearing. I do believe, based on what Mueller said today and in his last press conference, that we do need to begin impeachment proceedings so that we could just have hearings. We need these hearings. We need to have access to Barr's testimony as well as McGahn's testimony. And that's not possible under this president, because he's, again, obstructing justice. And so I think the Congress will have a greater authority and greater weight of law in order to take that testimony if they are indeed moving forward with impeachment hearings.
Do you think this is going to convince enough Democrats to feel the same way you do? I know House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is kind of keeping a distance.
I do.
She's not convinced
I think
yet.
the more facts that come to light and the more the American people understand what President Trump did, how his campaign worked with Russia, that Russia actually tried very hard to undermine and attack our elections, the fact that Robert Mueller found very many indicia of obstruction of justice, and that he wasn't exonerated on obstruction of justice, I think is key. So I do think it's going to change people's minds, and over time, it will also change members of Congress' minds. We may never get to the point where we actually have a vote on impeachment, but we should certainly start the hearings so the American people get the facts and the information that they're entitled to.
Let's look at one of the issues that's very important to Democratic voters, and that is health care. You have supported Medicare for all, like several of the other 2020 candidates. Does that mean that there is a space for private insurance? How would you go about this?
Yeah. So in 2005, when I ran for Congress in a 2-to-1 Republican district, I ran on Medicare for all. And the way I explained it then is that I thought Americans deserve at least one not-for-profit public option, one program where profits aren't the motive, that their patients come first, and that's Medicare. Let people buy into Medicare at a percentage of their income, and then it's always affordable. And I think if you can set that at 4 or 5% of income, matched by your employer, people will choose it. They'll choose it over their private insurer, and you're going to create competition. The most important way that you can get to universal coverage that's permanent and single payer is through competition. Allow the not-for-profit Medicare to compete on the open market. I wouldn't be surprised within 5 years, almost everyone buys into Medicare because it's better and it's less expensive. And then once you do that, your step to an earned benefit's very short. If there's only 30% who haven't bought in yet, you could easily then say this is an earned benefit, everyone will buy in, and it's how we make it permanent and it's how we make it universal.